All right, today we're going to get into a really dark and twisted investigation. It all kicks off with a chilling discovery, and, well, it ends with a brutal double murder. Yeah, a house of horrors and a web of lies. That's exactly what this is. It all started with just one phone call, but that one call led police to a scene that would pull the thread on a story just built on lie after lie. So let's set the scene. Police get a call, they head out to what looks like a totally ordinary house, just like any other on the street. But what they were about to find inside, that was the very beginning of a truly gruesome and complicated case. So they get inside this house, which belongs to a friend of one of the main players. And right away, investigators find exactly what they were dreading. They see traces of blood, and that confirms their absolute worst fears. This wasn't just a crime scene, this was the site of a double murder. Okay, so now that they know for sure what they're dealing with, the investigation really starts to tighten up. The focus narrows down to two huge questions. First, who were the victims? And second, who did this? It turns out the victims were two young women, and they had really different lives. On one hand, you have Mona. People described her as calm, kind, but she was going through a tough time, being stalked after a recent breakup. Then there's Hoda. She was more adventurous, had a history of what sounded like pretty chaotic relationships. I mean, two totally separate paths that just tragically ended in the same violent way. So the police pretty quickly zero in on their main person of interest, a guy named Adel, and his connection here is absolutely crucial. He was a close friend of Tariq, who, remember, is the owner of the house where it all went down. Now, this is where things get interesting. As soon as investigators start questioning Adel, his story, well, it starts to fall apart almost immediately. The details he's giving them just aren't lining up with the evidence they're finding. So what was Adel's initial story? Well, he tried to paint himself as just an innocent bystander. He claimed, hey, I just showed up, my friend Tariq was there, totally agitated, holding a gun, and he told me to get out. It was the perfect story, if only it had been true. And that was the huge problem for the detectives. You have Adel's story on one side, I was just an innocent witness, but it was completely contradicted by the evidence on the other. He claimed he was just a bystander, but forensic clues, circumstantial stuff, all of it pointed to him being directly involved in covering the whole thing up. I mean, the holes in Adel's story were just way too big to ignore. It left investigators with one massive central question. So what really happened in that house? Well, the weight of all that evidence just became too much. Adel's story couldn't hold up. Under some serious pressure from the investigators, his whole cover-up finally started to crumble. Yeah, he just couldn't keep the lie going. Once they confronted him with hard facts that he just couldn't explain away, Adel finally dropped the act. He abandoned his original story and confessed to his role in what happened after the murders. And his confession was, well, it was damning. He admitted to two huge things he did to cover it up. First, he took the murder weapon and dumped it in a remote area way outside the city. Second, he took his friend Tariq's car and cleaned it, specifically to get rid of bloodstains. I mean, think about that. Those are not the actions of some panicked bystander. That's a calculated attempt to destroy evidence, plain and simple. So, with the confession in hand and all the physical evidence laid out, the case moved into its final stage. It was time for the courtroom, where Adel would finally have to face the consequences for his actions. And the verdict? It was decisive. Despite all his attempts to point the finger at his friend Tariq, the court found Adel guilty. And not just for helping with the cover-up, they found him guilty of the murders of both Mona and Hoda. And the sentence for that conviction was 20 years. Actually, his sentence was initially 15 years of hard labor, but the court decided to increase it to 20, and they pointed specifically to the brutal severity of the crime and just how calculated that cover-up was. But that leaves us with one last kind of nagging question, right? Adel was convicted, sure, but what about the guy he helped cover for? What about his friend, Tariq, the owner of the house, the owner of the car, the man Adel tried to blame for the whole thing from the start? His fate, well, that's a story that remains just outside the frame of this particular verdict.